Hello, you're listening to Send in the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher and Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I am delighted to be joined by Tina Coope. She is a former teacher with a master's degree in education who, until 2019, taught across a number of settings, including both special and mainstream schools. Her experiences included teaching English as a foreign language to adults, leading a specialist autism provision, and setting up a nurture unit in a mainstream infant school. At the age of 7, Tina's daughter developed a sudden onset of severe neuropsychiatric symptoms. Her daughter went very quickly from thriving in a school setting to developing special educational needs and requiring a one-to-one teaching assistant. 5 years later, in early 2019, Tina discovered the charity PANS PANDAS UK and was taken aback by how many other families were supporting children with strikingly similar symptoms. Despite being a teacher herself, Tina had still not been able to get the message across that her daughter had not been born with these special educational needs. She started to volunteer for the charity, creating resources that she wished had been available for her own family. In 2020, she became the education lead for the charity. This rapidly growing charity is only one of its kind in the UK, supporting families living with PANS and PANDAS. It offers support and information to families and professionals in a position to help these young people. Their website hosts a wealth of information for educational professionals, and the charity is proud to offer online teacher training. PANS and PANDAS are medical conditions and so, of course, can only be diagnosed by medical professionals. Nonetheless, Tina feels that all educational professionals need to be aware of these signs, as they have a crucial role to play in spotting the early symptoms and in better supporting children and their families when armed with an understanding of the medical context. Hi, Tina. Lovely to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you as well. Thank you so much for having me on today.
You're very welcome. So could you tell us a little, we've introduced what PANS PANDAS are a little bit, but could you give us a bit more detail? Because I imagine for a lot of people, unfortunately, this might be one of the first times they've heard of it.
Yeah, you're right. So yeah, the charity, it's a small but rapidly growing charity. And it got going in May 2018 by a group of really determined parents, and they wanted to kind of raise awareness and improve the treatment guidelines to get UK treatment guidelines in place for children who had these conditions. So yeah, they work hard to support families. They've got a private Facebook group. I think there's about 5,500 members, and it's kind of rapidly growing. And they also work with a network of doctors called the PANS PANDAS network. They meet quarterly. And their vision is to ensure better outcomes for people, children and young people living with PANS and PANDAS.
Yeah, and what's your role in particular then? You're involved in education. Are you the education lead? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I write resources for families, help kind of families on an individual basis sometimes, although we've tended to move away from that now. We also offer teacher training, and we do some kind of strategic work in the background with designated clinical officers to make local authorities and those sorts of people aware of the conditions as well.
Fantastic.
So raising awareness, really.
Yeah. And speaking of that then, so what exactly is PANS and PANDAS then? Can you give it us a bit more detail on what it is?
Yeah, I can. So they've got really long names. So
haven't they? I like an acronym for this reason. I can understand you wouldn't be able to say the whole thing every time.
So even I'm now going to need to refer to my name. So essentially, you've got PANS, which is Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. Yeah. And although it's called PANS, although it's got pediatric in the name, it actually affects adults as well.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
Not just children. And then PANDAS, which is Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with streptococcal infections.
Right. So PANDAS is the one that's linked to strep. So after a child has strep, and whereas PANS could be other things. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's completely right. So PANS is a sort of a wider term, and that could be triggered by COVID-19. We've got a set of children that are affected by PANS, or chickenpox, flu, any infection really that could trigger that.
That's terrifying. As a parent, that's absolutely terrifying, isn't it? So these children just have these regular, chicken pox is a regular thing that children get. So they have these, and then their body has a different response to it. Is that what the theory behind it is then? And then, they get these sort of psychiatric problems.
Yeah, you're right. So it's a kind of a misdirected immune response, and the child's brain essentially.
Gosh.
And it causes a wide range of kind of neuropsychiatric symptoms, so neurological or psychiatric. And the symptoms the child get are really varied. So no one child who develops these conditions is the same. And we know that, it's really common. Children get infections all of the time, and I think it's fair to say we don't really know, or we've only got early evidence to suggest why some children develop these conditions kind of post-infections, and other children, obviously, they don't. They just get better.
It's quite scary, isn't it? Especially when this, and I'm sure a lot of parents listening will agree, this last autumn term and sort of winter time has been particularly bad for lots of bugs, and there was the strep A outbreak, wasn't there, and all of that. I bet that's been particularly terrifying. Have you been getting more members as a result of these viruses, or is it too early to tell?
So both of those in a way. So certainly from the strep A outbreak, the charity then needed to publish some information to kind of support the families on the group about that, in terms of raising awareness, in wider society as well, that this is one potential application for some children. Strep. But I need to emphasize as well, strep is very common, and all children will have strep. So if this is happening, why haven't we heard about it before? Because until I did research for this podcast, I didn't know very much about this. I think I'd seen you on Twitter talking about it, and that was probably the first time I'd heard about it. So it's obviously working, Tina. Twitter helps. But in general, I don't think many people have heard about it. And why is this going to be the first time people have heard about it? That is a really good question, and it's actually quite difficult to answer. Some of the things that I think might be behind that. There's been controversy about how the conditions should be categorized and treated. There's been issues about which umbrella of specialists they kind of come under. Is it neurology? Is it psychiatry? Is it immunology, for example? There's been a general kind of lack of training and knowledge. The term that we hear sometimes in the charity is that it's controversial. Actually, PANDAS is recognised by the World Health Organization.
Oh, right.
So I think it's just a few of those things kind of coming together that's created this really difficult situation and low levels of awareness.
Gosh, that must be really hard for parents, not only to see their children going through this, but to not get that diagnosis easy, and to not have anyone to support, I know there's you guys supporting them, but not have it as a general thing that people are aware of. It must be quite isolating until they find sort of the charity like you've got. Must be quite scary for them.
I think it is really isolating, because you've kind of got your child deteriorating in their functioning in front of your eyes. That might not be recognized, the extent to which they've developed those symptoms, and then you're unlikely to get a diagnosis, you're unlikely to be able to access treatment, and you find yourselves very quickly in a kind of a different position with schools as well. As your child may have been, being perfectly fine, thriving in their, educational setting, and suddenly things change very quickly.
Oh gosh.
And it's about getting that awareness out there about what might potentially be going on with some of these children.
Because you wouldn't make the link, would you? Initially, I'm just thinking, as a parent, if my child was poorly and then suddenly they had changes that with the behavior or the way they were acting, you wouldn't correlate the two automatically, would you? So it must take a long time for people to come to you and realize that there's a problem. A lot of Googling.
Absolutely, through Googling. But you're completely right. Your child might develop, a range of symptoms, and you would not be linking those naturally to an infection that they had, a few weeks before, because you wouldn't even know that that's possible to happen, probably.
No, exactly, which I suppose is why this is so important, that you're raising awareness so that people can get to the bottom of it a lot sooner and hopefully help these children. So how many children is it estimated to have PANS or PANDAS in the UK now?
That's a really good question as well, and the honest answer is we don't know. So there's one US statistic from PANDAS Network, and that says up to about 1 in 200 children.
Oh my goodness!
if that applied, and it's a big if, then that would be about 51,000
Oh,
children.
I had no idea.
But we can't say that.
No.
We don't know. But there are plans in place now for a surveillance study
Right.
in the UK to grasp, the extent
Yeah.
of this issue. Obviously, that's not straightforward by any means because children haven't been getting a diagnosis.
No.
But
So yeah.
we've got to start somewhere. And
Yeah.
with COVID and long COVID and all the brilliant work long COVID kids have done, they've put a lot of focus on these kind of post-infectious complications.
Yeah, is it just going off on that then? Is there a bit of an overlap, do we think, between long COVID and PANS PANDAS?
So we know that some children who've had COVID then go on to develop PANS. We know that. And I don't know if you're aware of the work that Helen Goss has been doing, but she's been very openly, she founded Long COVID Scotland, been very open about her own daughter and, the journey that they've been on, and her daughter developed PANS following COVID.
Oh, gosh. Oh, it's terrifying. And I was saying to you just before the recording, when I went on to the PANS Panda website, PANS Panda UK website, and I had a look at the videos, and I would urge our listeners to go and have a look at them because they're quite emotive. I cried because I'm very, very sensitive and emotional, but it is very upsetting as well. And there's a video and it shows some music and then it shows pictures of the children before looking healthy and happy and, having regular lives, and then showing them when they're suffering with this. And it's absolutely heartbreaking, isn't it? It's really, really, and I can't begin to imagine how upsetting and difficult it must be for families.
Yeah, it is. I probably can't express it. I probably wouldn't be able to express how difficult the situation is for our families. And I think it's important to say that doesn't just come from the symptoms themselves. They're devastating as well, but it comes from the current context of it's really hard to get diagnosis, really difficult to get treatment. It's really hard to get the right support that you need in school. It's hard for family even to kind of understand what's going on inside the walls of the family home, because you really would have to see it to, believe it.
Yeah, exactly. Believe it. I imagine, some people talking to of extended family members and people not believing them, which would be even more terrifying if you were experiencing it at home and then you're then telling, I don't know, grandparents or uncles and aunties what's actually happening, and then people are saying, oh, are you sure, or questioning you. That must be, and teachers questioning, because oh gosh, it must be really hard.
Yeah, I think it's a whole storm, really, a whole storm of things that are making things really, really difficult for families. And actually, that's the amazing thing about the support group is despite what these families are going through, the strength and resilience in the families and their ability to support other families is what they're going through it themselves. It's amazing, really.
Yeah, no, it does sound it. Yeah. So what might parents notice at home then if their child has PANS or PANDAS?
So it's a good question. And in some ways, it's quite hard to answer because every child's different. So I'll start with that. But there are some signs that you can be looking for.
Okay.
So firstly, there's a really wide range of the type of symptoms and how severe the child symptoms. So a common scenario is a child might get an infection. So for PANDAS, that would be strep throat. They might seem to get better.
Okay.
And then you might start to notice some things. And these could include, for example, the child might start saying they've got bad thoughts.
Right.
So they're often worried about harm coming to their family, or they might feel you're not safe. Or they might even have some visual images that you are being hurt or someone's hurting you. So your child will essentially start to become quite anxious and start to report bad thoughts depending on their age. They'll usually develop really quite severe anxiety. And this is usually about everything. So they start to worry about going to school, about their friendships, about pets. It can be traffic, family members, homework, spelling tests, any kind of assessments in school. They might start saying they don't feel safe, and they might start wanting to be with you a lot more than they did before, really. And that can be following you around the house, wanting to be hugged by you, can't sleep in their own bed anymore. Even to the extent of coming with you in the shower.
Oh gosh.
And then, it gets really, really difficult often to get these children into school,
Yeah.
before they've been skipping into school, all is well. And then suddenly the child is kind of devastated at the school gate.
Oh gosh.
And that's often because they're worried that something's going to happen to you while they're,
Oh,
during the
oh,
school
this
day.
is heartbreaking, Tina, isn't it?
It's really tough stuff. Other things you might notice, you might see behaviours you haven't seen before, like they may struggle to be on their own. They might struggle with basic skills like getting dressed or organising their school bag. They might stop wanting to do things they used to enjoy, like clubs. They might watch TV programmes from when they were a lot younger.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and they might want to watch the same programme over and over again. You might notice some physical changes. These could be tics. So some children develop tics. You don't have to have tics for PANS or PANDAS, but some children do develop them. And often children will develop kind of some toileting issues. Yeah. And this can be going to the toilet a lot or feeling that they need to wipe themselves continually. And what happens is that parents usually take them to a GP.
Yeah.
GP does a urine test on them and the urine test is clear. So it's really, if you're noticing a kind of cluster of changes of bad thoughts, behaviour changes, wanting to be with you, physical changes. Some children develop changes in their fine motor skills. So you might notice that they become really messy when they're eating, or they can't do up their shoelaces, or they can't hold a pencil or do writing in the way that they used to do. So there's lots of potential signs and symptoms. And I think it comes down to families really knowing their child really well before these changes kinds of occurred, and trying to map them all, give equal weighting to all the changes that occur, because that helps a child to get the correct diagnosis quicker.
Yeah. And how quick do these symptoms come on then? Like, is it over time? Is it like quite gradual, or is it, do you know what I mean? Like if they had the strep throat and then they got better, how soon after that are they getting these symptoms?
So I think we don't know. We don't know the latency period. The diagnostic criteria says it needs to be quite sudden. And how that's defined varies.
Yeah.
And many families do report that it's quite sudden. Some families even say it's overnight. But other families say there were early kind of bubbling signs or early warning signs when they look back.
Yeah, I suppose it's probably difficult to piece them together when you, at the time, you wouldn't know. But yeah, I suppose over time you might be able to look back and think, yes, there was something. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then there's a sudden onset then. Yeah. There's early warning signs.
So if they notice these symptoms, they think that's it, then can they get how do they go about getting a diagnosis or treatment? Is the treatment, like, what happens? Can you get better from this?
Yeah, there is treatment. And actually in the UK, the charity have just come together to form something called the PANS PANDAS working group. And this contains lots of different medical bodies, including the Royal College of Psychiatry and the Royal College Paediatrics and Child Health. And they've come together and very recently, actually in February, published an interim statement with medical guidelines.
Oh, brilliant.
So this should help a lot now.
Yeah.
Families are kind of going along to the GP. But I think a really good step is, if families notice this, is if they can kind of do a timeline.
Yeah.
They can kind of have a look which symptoms emerged when, and maybe if the child had any preceding infections. And that's really helpful information to take along to the GP. Yeah,
that's a good idea, like not noting it down and noting things, because I do that, when you're writing down, like when you've given them Calpol and things like that, you do start whenever they've got any sort of or it might just be me trying to remember when I've given them Calpol, but I often make a note of things with my own children, like when we've given them Calpol at this time, just in case, so you're aware if you have to go to the doctor, so you can tell them what's actually happened. I suppose it's doing that not just with but yeah, sort of with these other behavioural changes as well, and noting those down so that when you go and see a doctor, you've got this timeline, you've got these things to actually explain what's going on so they can get a better picture. Because it's hard as well when you sat with a doctor sometimes to remember it all, isn't it? And remember exactly what happened and when it started. So yeah, having it written down does sound a sensible idea.
Yeah, and it's really easy to miss some of the symptoms that might be part of the condition.
Yeah.
So it's really helpful if you can go to the website and look at the diagnostic criteria just to make sure that you're not missing something, because there's such a wide range of symptoms. And, you know, normally if your child develops issues with their writing and disordered eating behavior at the same time, you would not leave them as being linked. So that's the first thing. Things get missed. The second thing is giving equal weighting to what's happened in the child, because often it's the most dramatic symptoms that are focused on, and they tend to be psychiatric. So this, you know, crippling anxiety, or, you know, these kind of intrusive thoughts tend to be the symptoms that are focused on. It's really easy in the GP to then forget to mention, actually, you know, actually all of this is going on. And schools can really help with that as well, because teachers can help by kind of noticing these early signs in school. We've got a resource for that.
Oh, brilliant. And I suppose that helps families, doesn't it? If it's not just coming from them, if it's coming from a few angles, like we're noticing it in school, you're noticing it at home, and it's kind of building a bigger picture, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's really helpful if you have like professional evidence, and your professional evidence can also include evidence before your child got poorly. So if you at all, you know, and needs one-to-one support and all of these things, and they were fine before, it's really helpful to kind of have that evidenced as well, if at all possible. So look back on how they were doing before, look back if there's now issues with attendance, if their progress has dropped, you know, if everything's ongoing, have a look, how were they functioning before?
Yeah. And so how you said it's treatable, what do they actually, what medicine treats this then?
So there's like different, you know, there's different forms of treatment, and I'm not medical.
Okay.
So there's kind of anti-inflammatory immunology kind of approach.
Yeah.
There's kind of mental health support and psychiatric support. There's support that neurologists can give. So there's a kind of wide range of treatment options for children.
Yeah.
And in these updated medical guidelines, it signposts clinicians to two sets of guidelines. So if you go on there, you'll find out further information for that. So that,
no worries. So because a lot of our listeners are teachers, if they're thinking, oh, there's somebody in my class that, you know, didn't need support earlier on, but now is needing support, like how else might they notice it? How else does PANS PANDAS affect children in school? And I imagine this is going to be one of these answers that it could be anything, because it's going to be broad, because we've heard that from how it affects them at home. But what might they notice in the classroom?
That's a brilliant question. Again, no one size fits all. But there's some things that are really helpful to know. One is it's often confusing, and that's because it's known as a relapsing and remitting condition.
Right.
So a child will have an infection, and then they'll develop all these neuropsychiatric symptoms, and that's known as a flare.
Yeah.
And then that usually happens quickly. And then what usually happens is the child really slowly or gradually recovers. Again, the time that takes varies from weeks to months to even years for some children.
Oh, wow.
And then obviously the next infection comes along, the child is triggered again. And what we find sometimes is that children are slowly moving further and further away from their original baseline.
Right.
So the first thing I'd say to teachers is you're the keeper of the child's baseline. So go back and check how the child was managing before the onset of these symptoms, and if possible, capture their potential and capture their baseline and ensure that that's not getting lost. So how do children with PANS and PANDAS present at school? So firstly, they can be partly masking in school, like other conditions, which makes it a little bit...
does make it hard.
I know. And that's because some of the symptoms can be internal. Some of the children are going to look at their peers and do as their peers do. And also the child was performing in a different way before, so they're aware of their kind of change in functioning.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So yeah, as a teacher, you might see a child who had previously had an even profile, learning profile, they can develop a spiky profile. And that can be cognitively and socially and emotional. These conditions affect far more than just academic ability. You might notice the child in your classroom can no longer complete tasks that you're asking them to do. So a child who could previously listen, take on board your instructions, and then complete a piece of work can't do it anymore.
Gosh.
They can't absorb your instructions. They can't remember what you've asked them to do. They can't sequence the steps that they need to do. And then their writing ability may have been impaired as well. You might find a child who becomes very physically fidgety or mentally fidgety, very anxious, with low levels of concentration. And again, the key is what was typical for that child before.
Yeah.
Because of course, you might have a child who struggles with those skills anyway. But what you're looking for in these conditions is actually that child was really able to cope and concentrate and achieve well, and now they can't. Children often have difficulties with working memory. So you'll notice they can't really remember what you've asked them to do, or they'll get instructions muddled up. Some children have language changes. These can be subtle, or they can be quite severe.
Oh, wow.
Children often in schools feel really overwhelmed. So they might be distressed, or they might need to leave the classroom. They become very reliant on adult support, many of these children. They struggle with emotional regulation, so they might be very up and down. And you're going to probably notice some quite profound changes in their progress and attainment levels. So their progress might slow, or it might even go backwards in some cases.
Gosh, do lots of children get misdiagnosed with other sort of special education needs and disabilities then as a result of this? Do people think, oh, perhaps it's ADHD, or do you see what I mean? Does that happen?
It happens a lot because firstly, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. So that means that the other conditions need to be ruled out first. Secondly, it's a clinical diagnosis. So there's no one definitive marker. Say, there's tests you can do to check whether a child's recently had strep, but there's not one definitive kind of test that you do.
And if I'm just thinking, if you're having to exclude things first, knowing how long the waiting times are to find out if it is autism or ADHD or something like that, this could take ages to find out if it's PANS PANDAS, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And we've got children who aren't diagnosed for many years.
Oh my goodness. And then their whole childhood. That's horrible.
It is really, really challenging. And the symptoms look like other conditions as well. So if you didn't know the child before, you might look at them and think, I think they might have ADHD, or I think they might have autism, or I think they might have Tourette's syndrome, because the symptoms can look like conditions as well. And also they're really confusing. They keep changing.
Oh gosh.
And that's also really, that's not part of our education training really.
No.
And children, for example, can develop really severe sensory needs and sensitivity to sound, and then that symptom can kind of be gone to be replaced by a new symptom.
Oh my goodness.
Some of the learning difficulties that children develop, we might then perceive as developmental difficulties, because that would be the training that we've received. But in these conditions, it's often of acute onset. It's part of the condition, and it also can get better.
Yeah. Gosh. So if a teacher does, if they think or suspect a child, and obviously they can't medically diagnose, and I keep having to repeat this on the podcast, but they can't do that. But if they suspect a child has got PANS or PANDAS, what do they then do?
So it's a good question. So I think the very best thing they can do is start doing some observations on the child.
Yeah.
That will really help for the parents.
So it's like speaking to the parents as well, first and foremost, is probably advisable. So saying that they've noticed some difficulties, and see if it's happening at home as well, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So find out how the child's managing it at home, what have the parents noticed, and start to build up that picture together. It's really important to be aware that, parents of these children often end up in battles, or it ends up being quite difficult with schools, because what the parents are reporting might not be what the school are seeing. So it's really important.
That's so hard, on top of everything, to be having to battle. This is just awful. It's really heartbreaking. I'm feeling quite upset hearing about this. So So they've got all of this going on, and then people might not believe them. And then when they're saying to school, then they're almost having to like persuade them of what they're thinking. Oh gosh, this is really hard.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot of things kind of coming together. And I
Mm.
would say that schools have a massive role really in providing support for children and parents, even if that's just a listening ear, even if that's just being on the parent side and saying, look, we're here for you. We don't understand it either. This is really confusing for us. How your child is, presenting. And I guess what you're looking for as a teacher is kind of multiple unexplained changes in a child. So if you can see these changes and there's nothing going on at home and everything was okay before, then that might be the time to think, is it worth considering PANS?
Because I suppose the teacher is because a lot of these changes might not be something you go to your GP about initially. The teacher might be the first person the parent's spoken to about this potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are in a crucial position really to spot those signs, because they often know their children and their families really well. And we'd sort of say to teachers that the earlier they can kind of put in some support for these children, even if they don't have a diagnosis yet, and even if they don't know exactly what's going on, kind of the better, because we've sadly got children on the group who can't really engage with any education now longer term. And that's for many different reasons. But one reason is being in school when you're having all of these different symptoms, because children don't just develop one symptom, they develop lots at the same time. And those symptoms have a cumulative effect and interacting with each other. If a child's in an educational setting and they're, I don't know, hallucinating or have got terrible OCD, then that causes a long-term trauma for the child associated then with education. Really empathetic, compassionate, and kind of nurturing approach really as soon as the first signs are kind of identified, or you have suspicions that this could be the case.
And I suppose, like you said about the support, they can be supporting any of these needs. So if it is more that when you said about sensory and that side of things, if they're struggling with sensory, then you can provide support for that without knowing what the reason behind it is, can't you? You don't need to wait, in a sense. You can still be looking into it whilst you're providing support. And a lot of these supports are free anyway. You don't have to do very much. It's just small adaptations, isn't it, and tweaks you're doing in the classroom that could probably make a bit of a difference.
Absolutely. And if you bear in mind that it could be a medical condition, then that may also shape your approach. For example, many of these children struggle immensely with their handwriting, so their handwriting skills deteriorate. This can be really dramatic. Many children have something called margin drift, where it kind of floats down the page, so that can be a sign of PANS or PANDAS. But it's about schools knowing that that's linked to a brain condition. So if a child is flaring, and if they're well enough to be in school, because many aren't, but if they're well enough to be in school, it would be a case of school then compensating for those skills at that time, in a scribe or a different way of recording, or focusing on effort rather than outcomes, that thing, rather than perceiving the child as not trying hard enough. Which is sometimes what's happened, because the training's not out there and the awareness is not out there.
No, oh gosh. And so I was just thinking attendance wise as well, because you just said about obviously not always going to be well enough to be in school. I imagine we've touched on attendance in previous podcasts, but I imagine that's a bit of a problem, especially with shall we say, the more heavy-handed approach that the government seems to be going down with attendance.
Absolutely. I think that would be a podcast on its own.
Yes.
Just to say really briefly, it is an issue for many of our families. And I think it comes down to what's going on with the child being kind of misunderstood. And it comes down to not considering the child's long-term positive engagement with education. And what we find really, really helpful for many of our children is if they've got this key person in school, for which they can build a relationship and have some trust and be able to feel that they can share some of those really difficult kind of symptoms. And when that's in place, that begins to build this relationship between home and school, because school are then aware of far more of the symptoms than they might be otherwise. And child is also able to express some of those difficulties at school rather than just holding them all in and coming home after having your head bursting all day with thoughts and stuff. And then obviously at home, things are then really, really difficult.
Yeah. So a trusted person at school is a big one then. That must be really important. It's important for all children, let's face it, but yeah, in particular, even more so in this situation. So because there'll be teachers listening, hopefully. I always say that, there will be teachers listening, that will want to get some more information and further advice about this. Where should we be sending them then, Tina? Where do they need to go to find all this information out?
So if they go to the PANS and PANDAS website,
yep.
Number of resources there for families, teachers and medical professionals. And these can be invaluable, really, in terms of understanding the context of the conditions.
Yeah.
Teachers can sign up for free training for an hour, CPD accredited. You can contact the charity for any educational advice or support.
Brilliant.
You can on Twinkle.
Yes.
Resources. And what teachers can really do as well is signpost any other professionals, because it's not just teachers really that need to be aware. We need to raise awareness amongst occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, and other professionals who are doing assessments on these children. Yeah. And we don't really have any UK-led educational research on these conditions. Okay. So if there's any universities that are tuned in that deliver teacher training or training on psychologists, then this is an area that I think would definitely benefit from research. We did a short survey recently, and we found that several parents were then reporting that their child was achieving above expectations before the onset of the condition, and then after the onset they were achieving below expectations. Wow. So I think a whole wealth of educational research out there that and that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks ever so much. You've been brilliant. It's a tough listen, I think, this episode, but a really important one. So I hope it does help with your important work on raising awareness on this. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a difficult listen, but hopefully a really useful one as well. If you're looking for specific resources on PANS and PANDAS, we've actually got some free ones on the Twinkle website for you to have a look at, as well as an article written by the Digest team about PANS and PANDAS. And also I'll put the links to that, as well as the links to PANS PANDAS UK charity, in the show notes below, so do have a look at those. Thanks again for listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Please spread the word on social media that you've been listening, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel.